The Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, a linguistical and political science analysis. So then, let's get started. In the first part, we want to discuss the actual text of the Constitution and the amendment. What it says, as quoted from the Pocket Guide to the U.S. Constitution, is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's something every U.S. schoolchild has seen, or at least hopefully read once in their lives. Now then, we have to remember that the Constitution is described as the Great Compromise. It came after the Articles of Confederation. It wasn't ratified until about 1794, I believe, was the final date for ratification of the document. And there were a lot of compromises made, a lot of deals that were done between states to get the Constitution ratified. But the overwhelming concern of the founders of the new United States was how they would create a stable government minus a monarch and a traditional European nobility. They were also very concerned with making sure that their new government would be different from the one that they had rebelled against in the 1770s and different from the Articles of Confederation. So in doing so, they had to make a couple of different choices. One of those was on this idea of having a militia rather than a national army. Another one was on this, because of course the idea was by having a militia drawn from the people, that the people would therefore be more invested in the idea of keeping the United States going, rather than a state army, which would be, in their minds, a potential instrument of oppression, and more importantly, it wouldn't necessarily bind people to the national government, which they believed the militia would. It would also retain some form of independence for the state. It does eventually tie back into the idea of taxation, and if a national government existed and taxed the people to support a national army, then there wouldn't be that much influence from the state. Now then, moving on, what we need to get to is the language of the amendment before we move any further. So, the first word that we want to define is well-regulated. Well-regulated at approximately the 1790s would be very different from what we might necessarily think. There were very few officers or enlisted or non-commissioned officers in a traditional militia of the 18th century. They would have maybe a colonel and a captain. There wouldn't necessarily be sergeants or corporals. You might see a private, you might see a lance corporal, but most of the staff would be either a colonel or a captain or possibly a sergeant, and these would be the most militarily knowledgeable people in the local community, or possibly the wealthiest, because of course purchasing a commission was a thing in the 18th century. Now, moving on. A militia, before we get way too far into the weeds, a militia was a force of volunteer soldiers that was gathered from the local population for a variety of purposes. It could be fire, it could be apprehending criminals, it could be investigation, sort of like police. Necessary. Necessary means an essential to the survival thereof. Free state. By free state, what they most likely meant was an organized state that was not subject or tributary of another country or a colony. Infringed basically means revoked. Moving on. There is the problem, the issue of the comma. Now, what I was taught at university is that it was convention in the 18th century to tell the reader that a certain sentence was a conditional statement by including that comma. So, if we assume that, if we take that as read, then how the Second Amendment should be read is if or as a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state, comma, then the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. If the first premise is true, then the conclusion must be true. The premise being that a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state, and the conclusion is that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There have been, since the 18th century, a number of changes. Since the 18th century, the militia system was done away with. It lasted until only about the early 20th century. It would have been the last actual call-up of militia in that sense would have been the Spanish-American War, or possibly the Philippine insurrection. Since then, we have a national standing army, a national guard, police, fire services, and EMTs. All of these fill the roles, a specialization of labor that would have been done in the 18th century by the militia. Now it's done by specialists who are trained and employed to do only that job and nothing else. Now, and then there's also modern military regulations. The standing army is a much more heavily regulated organization than any militia or any state would have had in the 18th century. Modern regulations do not allow the carry of privately purchased weapons in combat. Now that doesn't necessarily include knives or things like that, but a modern US soldier is not going to be allowed to carry their Colt Python or their 44 caliber Dirty Harry pistol in combat. That sort of thing would be generally frowned upon. They aren't going to be allowed to purchase some sort of hyper amazing night laser vision scope. That wouldn't be allowed. So the world of today, and that's the whole point of this, that the world of today is very different from what existed in the 18th century when this amendment was initially written down. Now, here's where we get into the real meat and potatoes of the whole thing, or potatoes if you prefer, the economics. And this is the crux of the matter and the real heart of the issue, not to belabor that point, is that in the United States, firearms are a big industry. The worth to the US economy ranges depending on the source and how strict they are with their definition of gun industry. Can be anywhere between $70 billion and over $300 billion. Again, depending on how vague, depending on how diverse on what their definition of gun industry is. The firearms industry employs somewhere around 400,000 people, and to do away with that, or to regulate that, to severely curtail in any way through regulation, would be a massive hit to the US economy, and that's not something that any politician is willing to necessarily stomach or accept. And that's something that really needs to be acknowledged a lot more. That this isn't a moral issue, this is an economic issue. That's the fundamental problem. Now then, and here's why, that this is such a big thing, that if we look outside the United States, in countries that are also known for their gun manufacturing, like Belgium, where the FN, Fabrique Nationale, comes from. They made, throughout the early mid-20th century, the FAL, Fusil Automatique Léger, and the Mini-Me, a popular gun in the United States. That the contribution of the firearms industry of that company to the GNP of Belgium is only about 10 million US dollars. And if we take a look at Austria, Österreich, the home of Steyr, makers of the AUG, the abbreviation of that has sort of escaped me at the moment, is only around 32 million US dollars. The amount that these contribute to their national economies is very, very low. It's a minor percentage compared to the contribution of the gun industry in the United States. It can be replaced by other things like the automotive industry or internet services industry. It's not a big deal for these countries to severely regulate or severely curtail the contribution of those industries as it would be in the United States. So what we want to get to here is the fundamental point that the Second Amendment in the United States exists not for some sort of ideological reason. It doesn't exist for some mythologized history of the United States. It exists purely for the economic reason that the firearms industry contributes something like $70 billion to the economy, and no politician in their right mind is willing to severely limit that, especially think about reducing the amount of factories and causing all of those 400,000 people or some portion of those 400,000 people to lose their jobs. And that's the fundamental issue. It has nothing to do with the morality. It's all about economics and employment.